Hello, my name is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today is Wednesday, December 14th. As we make our way through the Advent season, I know for me as a teacher and as a homeschooling Catholic parent, we're trying to wrap up our studies for the fall term to prepare for the holiday season, take a break for a little while. Not take a break from studies or from any of our necessary duties, but from just the daily grind of work life and things like that. And I'm sure you're making similar adjustments, getting ready for the holidays, and you feel that stress. As much as there's excitement and happiness preparing for the holiday season, there's usually also a sense of stress and uncertainty that swells in our lives at this time, especially as parents. I've got 10 children, so for me, Christmas season gets stressful because I'd like to allow my children to enjoy the holiday season, and for them that largely means receiving gifts from their parents, as much as there's decorating to do and cookies to bake and things like that and dance performances or whatever. Gift giving, receiving gifts on Christmas Day in our family is pretty important for our children, and I want to give my children a happy Christmas celebration. And when you've got 10 children, it's expensive to do that, and challenging and stressful. Voluntarily stressful, not some kind of slavish anxiety or anything like that. But just I'd like to do good for the kids, and figuring out how to do that can be a little challenging. But there's a sense of stress in the midst of all of this happiness and fun. But if you share in my observation and some of my feelings, I feel like in our society there's an increasing chaos, mental chaos, spiritual chaos. And it just feels like life is crazy. I think back to my younger years, and I remember there was time where things were just quiet and it was boring. And we went places and did things, and I studied in the library, and it was take books out of the library and all these things, and it seemed that life was simpler back then. It seemed that life was simpler, that there was less distraction, less chaos, less or fewer influences trying to get my attention. And now I feel like it's just an endless flood of people and websites and emails and phone calls and text messages. And I wonder, how in the world are we supposed to function in this society as Christian people? It's so easy to get caught up in this chaos, and I don't want to. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can control these distractions and maintain an orderly life, because I've been wrestling with this personally, and I think that in my meditations and my own amendments of my life, as it were, I think I can identify some ways for us to gain control and free ourselves from this chaos that this generation, sadly lives in. The first thing is that, we choose what kind of business we're going to enter into. Some people are professionals, some people are salesmen, some people are work in information technology and services, some are in journalism, and you think about these different businesses, and they have different objectives. Take a journalist. You know, the whole stress and function of a journalist is to be the first. It's to be the first one to get the scoop, to get the story, to report the news. It's to be the first. That's the challenge. To reveal the secrets, to get the info, to find the story, to grab the picture, to get the video clip, etc. The whole challenge in journalism is to be the first. And in the modern media, you can see that being the first is nearly impossible. This is why social media platforms like Twitter are so influential. You can have feet on the ground at any event, posting pictures and videos and messages, instantly, anytime something happens. And it almost has made the need for journalism obsolete, because there's every person who has a smartphone is now a reporter. So the work of journalism becomes very different, because the whole goal is to be the first. And you can see how that challenge can just be miserable, to know that to be the third one to get the story is to be the last. It's just a very, very difficult kind of work today. And then you can think of other lines of work. Let's say being maybe being a librarian, where your job is just to keep the books and keep track of things and process the returns and all this. And it seems like it's a pretty calm and quiet job that isn't affected much by what's going on outside the library. So we can see there's different kinds of work, and some work, the very nature of that work is to always be first. It's to always have the breakthrough, have the scoop, have the new product, have the new campaign, have the news first, and so on. And in the modern age, that's becoming impossible work, because there's just, the whole world is your competition for any new thing. And so there's degrees from that, just total insanity trying to get the information first, all the way down to the most unaffected type of work that really has nothing to do with the latest information. And we choose to live somewhere in that spectrum between being the anxious newsmongers, or the sort of the retired contemplatives, I guess I could say. Those are sort of two opposite extremes. Now, when we think about the Christian life, aren't we supposed to be retired contemplatives? Well, no, because we're laymen. There are retired contemplatives. That's what religious life is for. That's what contemplative life is for. And if you have the opportunity, you can choose that state of life and that vocation and justly devote yourself to retired contemplation. And that's a great privilege. And if young men and women were wiser and more carefully taught when they were young, they would choose that path of life, because it's the happiest and best. But for the rest of us, we're laymen. And as laymen, we're subject to the constant change of the market. We can't just do things the way they used to be done. We can't do things the way we did them or the way we learned them when we were younger. We've got to pay attention to innovation and change and the desires of the market. That's just the nature of business. That's the nature of the market. And as laymen, we can't separate ourselves from the constantly changing market. That's what it means to do business. And if you're a layman, you have to do business. So you can see that depending on what kind of business we do, we're somewhere on this spectrum, from the craziest news chasers like the paparazzi, who are trying to get the first picture of every current event, all the way down the spectrum to the retired contemplative, which is possible for a lay person. I mean, my life as a classics teacher, self-employed, tutoring students, I mean, I think my life comes, relatively close to that kind of contemplative life. I'm not affected by much. But nevertheless, even in my case, I mean, I feel it. I feel the constant uncertainty, because you sit around wondering whether or not you're using technology intelligently, or whether you're developing programs or projects that are going to be obsolete when some new software pops up or there's some new platform developed. The constant development of technology creates sort of this constant threat of becoming obsolete. And that if you're running your own business or something like that, that's always in the back of your mind. Whether or not this project I'm working on, whether or not this platform or this service, whether or not it's going to last. And I'll give you an example of where I experienced this once. Back when the Classical Liberal Arts Academy first went online, I developed a world geography course using Microsoft 3D Maps. And it was an amazing course. We went through world geography, and I provided the students with links to these 3D maps of all of the locations of the places we studied in the geography course. So it was sort of this interactive 3D geography course using Microsoft's mapping technology. And it was an awesome course. And students were enrolled, they were loving the course and all this. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Microsoft decided that they were pulling the plug on their mapping program. And that was it. There was no real warning. Maybe there was an email sent out a week or two before the event, and then that was it. It was shut down. And we've seen this happen a number of times, even on the largest platforms, where the companies running these platforms simply change direction. And everyone who got on board with that technology, everyone who made use of it, suddenly has the rug pulled out from under their feet. And if you're working in business, this is a constant concern, whether or not we're building on sand with this or that project, or whether we can invest in this project because it's going to be allowed to develop and continue for an extended period of time. It's a constant, haunting concern in this kind of work. So even though you might consider, you might consider my work to be relatively stable, it's still under the influence of this changing technology. So it's a real concern, and I struggle with it because the anxiety or the uncertainty that it tempts us with, or arouses in us, is a problem in our spiritual life that can lead to all kinds of vices. So as I've been thinking about this in my own life, and I've been asking myself, how can I really gain control of this and not allow this technology to sort of govern my life and turn me into a slave? How can I manage my own life so that the news headlines aren't, constantly in my thoughts? And I think as Christians, we face a very great spiritual challenge that we're going to have to take up. We're going to have to embrace this challenge, and it's going to be very difficult. When my kids talk to me about things, I always tell them, it's easy to be good at many things, but in life we ultimately have to choose one thing. We can't be good at everything. We have to choose one thing. I could play sports. I could exercise more. I could run marathons. There's all kinds of things I could do. I could paint. I could draw. I could play music. I could travel. I could farm and build gardens, and we can go on and on and on, all the different things that I could potentially do, but I can't do them all. And ultimately, we have to choose one. And this is really the greatest challenge in life is deciding what to choose, what to do. What should we do? We ask kids when they're young, what are you going to do when you grow up? And it's the question is almost impossible to answer because there's so many, apparently, there's so many options. What am I going to do? There's so many options. But when we get into things and when we actually, enter into them in space and time, we find that there are not many options. There's an appearance of many options, but there are not many options. And God's providence, if we're careful to pay attention to it, it sort of leads us where we belong. And it's good for us to recognize that and then to be content with, our lot, as it used to be said. So determining what our lot is part of the problem with all of this, because one of the reasons we're worried about the news and the technology is because we're not convinced that we know where we ought to be. We're not convinced that we know what our lot is. And we're sort of constantly looking, constantly searching to try and find out if we're in the place where we belong. And we can never be certain. And here's why we're like that. The reason that we feel uncertain about where we are and whether it's where we belong is because we've chosen to identify with some secular occupation. We've chosen to characterize ourselves by some secular occupation or profession. So if someone meets you and says, hi, how are you doing? And they want to know who you are. You tend to identify yourself by your secular profession. You say, I'm a doctor. I'm a school teacher. I'm a housewife. I'm a carpenter. Whatever. You identify by your secular profession, and you do so because you think, well, that kind of gives some stability to who I am. I'm a teacher. I'm a carpenter. I'm an auto mechanic. But the problem with identifying with a secular profession, first of all, we don't need to identify with a secular profession. But what I think is troublesome about this, and we've been trained to do this in modern society, to see ourselves as members of a workforce and to identify by the place we occupy in the workforce. And so we identify by a secular profession, and then we ask, is this where I should be? Is this the secular profession that I should identify with, or should I do something else? Maybe I should find another line of work. And the market's constantly changing, and the technology is constantly changing, and the news is constantly changing. And here we are trying to find stability, trying to find an identity in a circle that is constantly changing and is, of its very nature, unstable. And so because that world, the secular world, is itself by nature unstable, constantly changing, and we identify by our place in that secular world, we're constantly unstable too, because we're basically tethering ourselves to something that's constantly moving, maybe even disappearing. And this produces in our lives a sense of instability and constant change. We can easily fix that problem in our lives by identifying first, not by our secular occupation, but by identifying by our or with our religious vocation. We can identify by something that's stable and doesn't change. So a priest, for example, can simply identify as a priest of the church. A monk can identify as a monk. A nun can identify as a nun. And we look at them and we say, their lives seem more stable than ours. And the reason why is because they have identified by their religious vocation, which, even though the circumstances may change, a priest may be sent from one parish to another, and the culture be different, and the demographics all be different. Nevertheless, the work of the priest largely stays the same, and his identity is unchanged. And there's a lot about his life that doesn't change as he moves from circumstance to circumstance. Same for a monk or a nun, even though monks and nuns, they're often required to stay in one place. So they have the extreme experience of stability and constancy in their life. And we look at that. If you've spent time with religious, you look at that and spend time with them, and you say, man, they're so spoiled. They just get to enjoy this peace and quiet, and it's so peaceful and beautiful, and oh, I wish I could do it. Well, it's not our vocation. If we've already chosen, let's say, marriage and gotten married, well, that opportunity is over. So we're in the world. We're secular. We're laymen, and we often identify because we feel like being layman is not an identity. It's sort of like it's like the default state of life, religiously speaking. And so then we identify by our secular profession, and like I said, that's not a source of stability. It doesn't give us a stable identity or life or routine or culture or anything else because the market's constantly changing. To be a carpenter, for example, in 1980 is completely different than to be a carpenter in 2022. I remember growing up, my father was an electrician, and his electrical work when I was a little kid was completely different from the electrical work that we were doing when I helped him while I was in college. We were putting in computer systems and all of this different kind of computer cabling and things like that with all these fine, delicate tools. And that work, the work of the electrician in, I guess it was around 2000, was completely different from the work that electricians were doing in 1980. And that's how professions change. I'll give you another example that just popped into my head. When I was in high school, I actually wanted to be an architect. My family all worked in construction. I liked to draw. I was artistic, and I wanted to be an architect. And so through my high school years, my high school gave me the opportunity to take classes in mechanical drawing and sort of introductory architecture work as an elective, and I did it all 4 years. I took these drafting classes, and at the time, this was from like 1989 to 1993, the first 3 years, everything was done with pencil. It was all on paper with pencil, and we learned all of these techniques for this, mechanical drawing, and I loved it. And that's what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to go to college, and I wanted to study architecture and do some kind of drafting for a living because I loved drawing. I was mechanical. I had this mechanical family, and mechanical drawing was my delight, and I wanted to be an architect. Well, senior year in high school, all of a sudden, there's a wall of computers in this mechanical drawing classroom, and we're told that we're not going to be drafting anymore. We're not going to be drawing with paper and erasers and pencils and all the different tools we used, but we're going to be learning something called AutoCAD, and we're going to be learning how to do CAD, computer-aided drafting. So all of the work of mechanical drawing and architecture was being moved to computers. And so I sat there as they began to teach us how to draft using computers, and I said, I have no interest in this. I have absolutely no interest in being an architect if I don't get to draw. I don't want to work like this with a computer. And so the technology changed the industry, and I would argue changed the kind of person interested in architectural work or mechanical drawing. And for me, made me completely uninterested in that line of work. And thankfully that didn't happen my junior year of college. I can't imagine I can't imagine that there were kids who were halfway through their studies in college still drawing and doing the work manually when all of a sudden this technology came around and they were stuck either in college or in professional school or in the field itself. I'm thankful that I didn't get stuck at that point with this technology. But the technology completely changed the field, completely changed the profession, made it of interest to a different kind of person. And so where I was identifying as a future architect as a kid, the technology pulled that carpet out from under me. And that led to the pursuit of other things. And then, as I went on, I ended up becoming a classicist. And that's a long story. But the point is, as the technology changes, the professions change. And that's why we can't identify as laymen by our professions. It's more complicated than that. So as I consider my own life and I try to get control of my own life, I think, well, how can I free myself from all of this distraction and chaos? And over the past few years, I've committed to becoming a lay Dominican. And as a lay Dominican, there are obligations that we promise to fulfill, and they're challenging obligations. To attend daily Mass, to pray the Rosary, to pray morning and evening prayer, to read the Scriptures, to study, to work in some kind of Dominican apostolate where we're doing the work of preachers in the church and in the world. And I have this list of things I've got to do all the time, and they're time-consuming. It's not easy. Much more difficult than I ever expected, which has been very, very satisfying to me. But I see that identifying as Catholics first, ordering our daily routine around the duties of the Catholic life first, setting the bar high also, not doing the bare minimum, but saying, I want to go to daily Mass. I'd like to pray the Liturgy of the Hours. I'd like to pray the Rosary every single day. I'd like to pray the whole Rosary, all of the decades, every day. Setting the bar a little higher gives us an identity and challenges us to focus on those activities every day and causes us to step away from the sources of all of the constantly changing information and distractions. And you see, it's a real challenge of faith, because when I step away from the technology, when I step away from the marketing audience, when I step away from the social media, step away from the marketplace, and sit alone in a room and pray, it's a statement that I'm making. I'm making a statement that I think my future, whatever it may be, my future depends more on the fruits of this time that I spend reading the Scriptures or praying or meditating on the Catholic faith. My future depends more on this than on keeping up with all of the modern news and technology and this and that. My devotion to God will put me in a better place in the future than any effort I make to try to keep up with society, as it were. And you can see that's a real statement. I confess it's a statement that's kind of frightening. It's difficult to embrace. And I know that the big mouths will say, oh, no, it's not. Yes, it is. It's difficult. It's difficult to actually do it. Not to talk about it on social media, but to actually do it, to burn some bridges, to cut some ties that can't be remade. It's difficult. And it's kind of scary, especially in my situation. I've got 11 people depending on me every day to provide for their needs. So when I move, it has significant effects on everyone's life that I'm in contact with. And so we can see that choosing to focus on spiritual duties, choosing to put them first. And you can see that this is exactly what Jesus says when he says, seek first the kingdom of God. He says, do not be anxious about the things the Gentiles seek. He says, take no thought for your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will wear, and these things. Take no thought for tomorrow. That sounds nice, and we may all say it, but we don't do it. It's difficult to actually practice. It's difficult to practice because in order to practice that, you've got to take a risk. You've got to make a statement. You've got to make a choice. And you've got to actually act and walk by faith. You've got to actually believe that by focusing on God and praying and meditating on God's Word and learning God's will and carrying out your spiritual duties to the best of your ability, to the greatest extent that you can, you are going to be in the best position in the future, even though you're going to not necessarily keep up with all of the things that the Gentiles or the unbelievers are working on. You're not going to have the news. You're not necessarily going to know what the breaking technology is. You're not necessarily going to be able to forecast the next big rise on the stock market because your thoughts and your studies and your meditations are someplace else. You're not going to be the person to consult for advice on the latest technology. You're not going to know all of the latest breaking news. You're not going to watch every video on the internet or keep up with every post on social media. It sounds easy, and every Christian will talk about this and say it, but to actually practice it, is next level stuff. And, I find myself at a point in life where I'm really challenged to make a break and burn some bridges and make decisions that have significant effects. Now, it's kind of funny because you can say, well, you're sitting here talking about this stuff. You publish your lessons on the internet. You've got social media channels of your own. You're posting videos on YouTube. Aren't you part of the problem? And it's sort of a funny dilemma to be in that I'm not unaware of. I think about it all the time. And I can say honestly that my heart would love to just pull the plug and, like the scene where Bilbo puts the ring on his finger at his birthday party and just poofs, disappears. I'm the kind of person that would be very happy to do that at any minute, but there are consequences and implications that make that a little more difficult, and they're not just financial consequences. I'm not afraid of losing money. I grew up poor. I was poor as a young adult. I'm not afraid of being poor. It's got nothing to do with money. It's got to do with what I consider to be my life's work and how that work actually gets done. And I consider all of my life's work. So raising my children, teaching other children, promoting classical Catholic studies. It sounds nice to say I'm going to pull the plug and just vanish off into the woods. But what about my life's work? What about my life's work? It's not going to be done necessarily. So it's more complicated than just this silly talk about going off the grid. As I said before, there's sort of a spectrum, and happiness is found, I think, in finding our place in that spectrum, with retired contemplative life being the sort of absolute happiness, the most possible happy place in life, and then a spectrum moving from that to increasing distraction and chaos and busyness, and we have to find our place and enjoy sort of a relative happiness where we have a relatively tranquil life, a life that's relatively free from distraction. And there's sort of a range that we live in where by our choices we can be more contemplative or more distracted. And we've got to make decisions to stay to the contemplative side of that range. That's really the challenge. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but the idea is we have to use the technology just because it's how our society works. Just like we have to use automobiles, we have to use pen and paper, which were once high-tech. We have to use the technology, but we really have to be careful that we're using the technology and that the technology manufacturers and sellers are not using us. That's the challenge. You know, it's one thing to say, I use this phone for my business. It's a very different thing when I'm reacting to the newest phone that's released and I'm downloading the app because I saw an ad for it, and I'm constantly reacting to new stuff, and I'm not actually focused on my study or my business. I'm actually simply reacting and responding to this constantly changing technology. That's the difficulty. So what I'm focused on in my own life is by making my spiritual duties, by first of all identifying by my religious life, by identifying by my spiritual life and saying, I'm a Catholic layman, I'm a Christian. In my case, I'm a lay Dominican. That gives me an identity that's stable. That's who I really am. I can make money in 1,000 different ways, but my purpose in life is centered in my Catholic life. It's not in my secular profession. My secular profession can take 100 different forms. I'm not bound to any one project or any one activity or any one place. Earning a living, providing for my family, helping others through the work that I do. There's a million different ways I can do that, and I don't need to identify by my secular profession. It's wiser for me to identify by my spiritual identity. I'm a Catholic, I'm a Christian in the world who has a mission to preach the gospel to everyone that I can. I've got other responsibilities as a lay Dominican, which I named before, and those really need to be the pillars of my daily life. And I can't allow other influences to come in because I'm not accountable to all those other things. I'm not accountable to the latest technology. I'm not accountable to whims of the market. I don't have to be on the cutting edge of the market. I don't have to be on the to constantly fighting for the smallest little sliver of the market or niche. I don't need to live like that. I need to make sure that I fulfill my Christian duties because that's really who I am. That's what I am. I'm a Catholic. I'm a layman who has a mission. The mission of the laity is to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. I've got a job in the world that I'm supposed to be doing, and it's not making money for myself. I've got a much broader, much more significant role in the world than just finding a paycheck someplace. I'm responsible as a Catholic layman, just as a bishop is responsible for his role and a priest is responsible for his role. In the church, as a Catholic, I'm responsible to be directing temporal affairs according to God's will, to have that effect of salt and light in the world, not to just be part of the big river of human custom racing all in one direction. I'm supposed to be offering resistance where that society begins to run contrary to God's will. I'm to be moving in God's will and seeking to lead others with me in the pursuit of God's will, to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. That's my vocation as a layperson. And in my unique situation, I'm a classicist. I teach children classical liberal arts and adults. I teach classical philosophy. I teach the classical languages. So I have a specific work to do. But even that work can manifest itself in many different ways, and it's not what I can really identify with. I can identify by the mission in general, but not by the specific work. And that's my unique identity. I'm a classicist by trade, and I'm a lay Dominican, so I have other things to attend to as well. And your circumstances and your identity is the same in many of these things, but different in the actual application of them. So you, like me, are a Catholic and a Christian. You have the same responsibilities I have as far as preaching the gospel and doing the works of mercy, saying your prayers, studying God's word. These are your duties as a Christian. And in that, our lives have identity and stability and similarity. We have a similar life. And that you can see, that's where Christian culture develops, because there's similar concerns, similar works for us to do together. And that's where our relationship as Christians develops. It develops in those things which are stable, which are the same between us. And we should identify by those things, by those activities. How can we reach our neighbors? How can we lead our neighbors into the church? Those are the kinds of things that we should be talking about. We should be concerned with collaborating to actually carry out our necessary Christian work and identifying ourselves, first of all, as Christians, not by our professions and things like that, but by our actual spiritual identity as Christians. That's what we are first. When we read, St. Paul's epistles, for example, St. Paul introduces himself as Paul, servant of Jesus Christ. That's who he is. That's his identity. He doesn't say Paul, tent maker. That's not what he says. He doesn't talk about he doesn't introduce himself with his, academic titles and things like that. He says, Paul, I'm a Christian. That's what I am. That's how he identifies. And that's where that peace of life, the tranquility of life that he teaches about comes from. It comes from identifying as a Christian. And everything else is second. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be given to you by God. And so if we think about what are our duties, we can start with things like the precepts of the church. We have to do those. Those are the bare minimums. Those are the necessary rules. We have to attend Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. We have to make confession at least once a year. We have to support the church materially so that the priests and the bishops and all of the different religious within the church can attend to spiritual works and have their needs provided for by the contributions of all the laity. So we have things to do as members of the church that are precepts or commandments, and we have to do those things. And our life finds stability in focusing on those things. And then when we go beyond them to our spiritual duties that obviously go beyond that, those are the bare minimum essentials. When we go beyond that, we say we need to study the scriptures. How often? Well, Psalm 1 says, "Blessed is the man," I'll read it, I've got it right here. Psalm chapter 1, let me read it. And I encourage you to read and either memorize or at least meditate on Psalm 1. It's really significant. Just listen, Psalm 1. "Blessed is the man who hath not walked in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stood in the way of sinners, nor sat in the chair of pestilence. But his will," or his delight, "his will is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he shall meditate day and night." So if we read Psalm 1, we read that the nature of the blessed man, which is what I would hope to be, the nature or the habit of the blessed man is to meditate on the scriptures day and night. And so we've got an obligation to do that. Unless, what are you going to say? You don't want to be the blessed man? We have to meditate on the scriptures day and night. If we're not doing that, then we're not like the blessed man. We could say whatever we want, make any excuse we want. I'm sure he faced the same excuses and challenges we do. We've got to do that. We've got to identify as the blessed man. And the blessed man, his delight or his will is in the law of the Lord. And on his law he meditates day and night. We've got to do that. So we've got the study of the scriptures, which for us is a whole lot more complicated than it was in David's time, who wrote the Psalms. We've got the scriptures. In the Catechism, in the Baltimore Catechism, we learn, where do we learn the truths that we're to believe, to be Catholics? And we learn that the chief truths with which the Church teaches, we learn them from the Church, first of all. They're contained in the Apostles' Creed. And then if we look at the catechisms, the catechetical tradition of the Church, we see that the Apostles' Creed is expounded and expanded into all of its details. And we're led into a meditation on the implications of the words of the Apostles' Creed. So we've got theology study to do. We've got to learn what the Catholic Church teaches. And that takes time and effort. We've got to do that. It's not an option. That's not an option. How can you even identify as a Catholic if what you're doing, you don't even know if it's Catholic or not because you haven't even studied the teaching of the Church? How can you identify as a Catholic? Why would you identify as a Catholic if you don't even know if whether what you're doing is in fact Catholic? So we've got to study the Catechism of the Church, and the Catechism of the Church is several thousand paragraphs of teachings that need to be studied. This is no easy task. This is something that has to be worked at constantly, daily. Then we've got things like the Liturgy of the Hours. The Liturgy of the Hours is the official prayer of the Church. You've got prayers provided to us for the entire year, 5 times a day. Office of Readings, morning prayer, daytime prayer, evening prayer, night prayer. This is all sitting here waiting for us. If we would identify as Catholics and make this the foundation of our life, we would have peace. We wouldn't care what the news says because, look, who cares what technology does? Who cares what's going on in the news? Who cares about the market if I'm not even doing my own work as a Catholic by which I identify myself? So I'm only interested in those things if I've already taken care of what I say are the most essential things in my life by which I identify. So if I'm not saying my daily prayers, if I'm not meditating on the scriptures, if I'm not studying the catechism, if I'm not seeking wisdom, what interest do I even have in the news or in the market or technology? I have nothing to contribute that's valuable as a Christian, which is how I identify myself. And so I think that in all this chaos that we face, I think there's a real challenge that's set before us. And the challenge is, how are we going to identify ourselves? Are we going to identify as, innovators? Are we going to identify as secular professionals? Are we going to identify by some work we do to try and get something from the market? That's a constantly changing, unstable life. Or are we going to identify first and foremost as Christians and have the pillars of our daily activities be our spiritual duties, which make us Christians, which allow us to claim to be Christians? For example, I have a cross. I don't have it on right now. It's right here on my desk. But I have a cross that's given to me as a token of my position or my place as a lay Dominican. Well, what's the point of wearing that cross and identifying as a lay Dominican if I don't actually practice and fulfill the promises of the lay Dominican life? It makes no sense. What's the point of identifying as a Christian and then not actually studying the things the Christians are supposed to know? What's the point of identifying as a Christian and then going into the secular world and not even knowing church teaching, so you don't even know how you should be trying to influence temporal affairs? If you're going to identify as a Christian, then learning to think like a Christian would have to come first. Doing the spiritual works of a Christian, having the graces that are supposed to be had by Christians, those things would have to come first, or else you're not a Christian carpenter, you're not a Christian teacher, you're not a Christian lawyer or doctor, because you don't even practice the things that make a person Christian. You don't even know what Christians are supposed to believe. So how can you identify as a Christian doctor? You're just a doctor who identifies as a Christian. To be a Christian doctor is something different. To be a Christian lawyer, a Christian nurse, a Christian teacher, a Christian craftsman, well, that's something different. That's a craftsman or a nurse or a doctor who knows what a Christian is to know and who practices first and foremost, before anything, what a Christian is to practice, and then follows the light and wisdom of his Christian life into his profession and directs it according to God's will. That's a very different thing than simply being a carpenter who calls himself a Christian. And that's the challenge I think we're facing. We're facing the challenge in the midst of this constantly changing world of technology and demand in business and products and resources and supplies, and politics is interfering with all this stuff, and there's all this political chaos, and on it goes. All of this media confusion and interruption in our lives, and we sort of look at all this craziness and we say, how can we order our lives in the presence of all this? And the answer is, identify first as a Christian. Devote ourselves first to the habits, the routines, the disciplines, the knowledge of Christians, and allow that to establish the stability and focus of our lives, and then enter into these other things as Christians. Enter into these other things as men and women who have said their prayers and who receive the sacraments and who do the Christian duties and who carry out the works of mercy, who actually know the catechism of the church, who know the sacred scriptures, who have the graces at work within them, who then enter into these fields in a meaningful way, in a redeeming way. That's the challenge. And if we do that, I think we'll find that we don't depend on the latest technology and the breaking news, and we don't have to be, on the front of the wave all the time. Because often these market trends and these technology trends, they pop up, they impress for a little while, and then they vanish. And that's really not where we want to be anyway. We really don't want to be the people, there's a name for them in marketing, people who, first adopter, I think they're called in marketing. People who, anytime something new comes out, they're on it. They've got the new Jordans and the new iPhone, and they've got the new car. They're going to have the Tesla truck that comes out when it comes out. They're always on the cutting edge. We don't need to be that person, because what we have and what we do should be of a higher quality, because it's true and it's timeless and it's proven and so on. That should make what we do more valuable. What we do is true. What we do is right. What we do is trustworthy and timeless and proven. What we do in our professions is influenced by this wisdom. And so the methods we use, the techniques we use, what we teach, what we do, how we manage our business, the source of that should be this timeless, unchanging wisdom. There should be something of a peace about us that others can sense, that there's a peace in the Christian soul that's not in people in the world. There's a peace and order in a Christian business or a Christian school that's not in a secular business or a secular school. People should sense that, and they won't care if we have the latest technology or the biggest building, or if we know all the latest news stories and are up on all the political gossip and controversies. There will be something deeper, more substantial, and permanent in what we do, because we've made ourselves Christians first and then entered into our work secondly as Christians and created a quality, I want to say reality for some reason, but we've created a quality that the world simply cannot mimic. I feel that way about the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. While there's all of these changing things and, there has to be this adaptation, there's a foundation of truth and quality that the Classical Liberal Arts Academy was built on that separates it from everything else. And all the other stuff will take care of itself. And anyone who comes to the Academy for the right reasons, looking for the right things, will see that they're only found here. And those coming looking for other things, well, they can leave because, not to be disrespectful, but they're like the chaff. They're not focused on the unchanging principles. They're simply looking for the latest technology or colored books or some other accidental that has nothing to do with the essential work that's to be done. So I think that this chaos we feel, this constant distraction, the way for us to not demonize, because there's nothing wrong with the technology. We tend to react to it in an oversimplified, stupid kind of way and demonize everything. Blame it, for our problems, for our misuse of it. We blame the technology because we don't control ourselves, which is just foolishness. But if we commit to identifying first as Christians, doing the things that Christians are supposed to do, we go to church, which, for many people, for all their talk, don't even take it for granted that they go to church regularly. We go to Mass when we're supposed to. In fact, we go to Mass as frequently as possible. We say our daily prayers. We don't just talk about praying, we actually pray. We read the Scriptures. We don't talk about the Scriptures, we actually study the Scriptures regularly, daily. We meditate on them daily as a priority. We study the Catechism of the Church. We don't simply talk about the Church, we actually study and practice what the Church teaches. If we identify first as Christians and commit to those things as the pillars of our daily schedule and the priorities of our lives, we'll eliminate most of the chaos and distractions because we have a lot of work to do. Then, having established that character and identity, if we go into our professions with the wisdom of the Church and of the Scriptures, guiding our daily work so that we can direct it according to God's will, we'll find that we're really not dependent on the constantly changing technology. We're really not dependent on the whims of the market. We're really not dependent on those things. We don't have to try to beat other companies or beat other people in all of these silly accidental things. We don't have to have the newest website. We don't have to have the fanciest video editing. We don't have to have the latest and greatest of this and that, because what we have is actually better because it's true and it's permanent and it's real, because it's Christian. And that needs to be what becomes our focus. And we can see that that's the quality of life that we can all sense is missing from modern Christian society. Modern Christian society has this Walmart feel to it because it's lazy and it's not really Christian, and we all know that. If we would commit as Christians to really being Christians first, and then bring that real Christianity into our different secular applications, we won't have to talk about restoring Christian culture because it will simply be restored. Necessarily. It will be restored because Christians will be directing temporal affairs according to God's will, which is what Christian culture is. So, in my life, as I said, my promises as a lay Dominican challenge me greatly, and I just don't have time to do other things, because to say my daily prayers and do what I'm supposed to do, I've got to keep a tight daily routine just to check my boxes. So as I've experienced that myself, and as I've felt the sanctifying and calming influence of those duties in my own life, I have felt that sort of trickle down into the rest of my activities, and it provides me with balance. And I'd like to encourage other Christians to realize you're never going to pray after you get everything organized. You're never going to study after you get all your secular affairs established. That's not the order in which it works. You have to start praying and going to Mass and studying first. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And then you will find that these things can be ordered. They will be ordered by your Christian life. So I'd like to challenge you in that. I'm challenging myself in this right now as I enter into Christmas break. I've got a list of changes that I'm planning to make, which will become my New Year resolutions, which I encourage you to prepare while there's time. And if we can learn to identify first as Christians and then prove that we actually are the Christians we identify as, and then go as those Christians into our different lines of work, we'll have purpose in that work we do. We'll not be subject to this tyranny of constant change and development. We'll be able to focus on timeless principles that apply to the work that we do, and we'll concern ourselves with directing our work according to God's will, which will bring it the greatest kind of success, the only kind of success that we should even desire. And we won't have to concern ourselves with cheap and counterfeit signs of success which occupy the minds and concerns of those who are, enslaved to this constant development. So I hope that's helpful. That's a lot to take in, but if you're a lay person, have you ever thought about third order religious communities? I learned about it later. If you're a lay person, why aren't you a Benedictine? Why don't you join the Third Order Carmelites? Why don't you join the Third Order of St. Dominic? There are third order communities where you can engage and, gain a clearer identity as a Christian, as a lay person, and not just be left like some Protestant wandering in the world, but you can really zero in on, your unique interests and sense of mission and purpose and devotion, and find community there. Be accountable to that community. And I'm telling you, receive a great deal from that community. Don't live like a Protestant and expect to have the happiness of a Catholic. Because Catholic happiness is rooted in community. Now, that's one of the lessons that I've learned over time. We're social animals, as St. Thomas and Aristotle teach, and we're not happy living in isolation. We're not designed to live in isolation. We're designed to live in and serve a community and to receive the service of a community. So if you're a lay person, I encourage you to learn about third order communities. Think about your unique interests. If you're a worker, you're You identify yourself as a worker. Well, why not consider the Third Order or the Oblates of Saint Benedict? Have you ever learned about that? If you're interested in works of mercy and caring for the poor, why not learn about the secular Franciscans? If you're interested in education and teaching and preaching the gospel, why not learn about the Third Order of Saint Dominic? If you're interested in contemplation and prayer, and you love Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross, why not join them in the Carmelite order as Third Order Carmelites? That's what the Third Orders are. You're not just lost in the world because you're not a priest or a monk or a nun. Why not consider Third Order community life and learn about that? If you'd like to learn more about that, let me know. I can help you to get started because I know quite a bit about it now. But there's more to the Catholic life than this wandering, secular life that just shows up at church once in a while. This constant struggling in the world. You have to get yourself into the right place, into the right soil with the right conditions to help you so that you can grow. So make your identity Christian and allow that Christian identity to be established by Christian habits, and then have those habits bring you the fruits of the Christian life, and then bring those fruits into your different secular occupations. If we do it in that order, we'll find that we're not, enslaved to this modern technology and constant change and confusion and the news craziness and all this gossip culture. So I hope that's helpful. God bless you all.